Okay, I'm going to address something today which I'm going to title, Don't Judge My Quietism. Now, what does that mean? Throughout history, the church has had to balance this idea of how much trust do we put into secular authority and also into church authority. And the reason I'm bringing this up is recently there was a Christian guy back in Dearborn, Michigan, that confronted the mayor, who is a Muslim, about them giving honor through putting the name of a pro-jihadi guy, a pro-Hamas guy, putting his name on a street sign. Okay, of course, this guy, he's a Christian, and he was a little bit offended by that, and so he went and confronted the mayor. And the mayor basically blew him off and said, "You're not welcome in my town. As a matter of fact, we'll have a parade when you leave." Okay, so let me read a verse out of Romans, and let's try to figure out what's the best way, or what is a biblical view on how to deal with civil authority that goes amok. Now, in Romans chapter 13, Paul, now keep in mind, Paul is living in a time when the Romans pretty much ruled Israel, and they weren't always just. However, God used the Romans at times to protect Paul from Jewish authorities that were wanting to have him killed. So he found himself in a somewhat sticky situation, a sticky wicket, as the Brits would say. So he had to honor Roman authority, even though Roman authority wasn't always just. So, but look what he says here in the book of Romans, chapter 13. He says, "Let every person be in subjection to the governing authorities, for there is no authority except from God, and those which exist are established by God. Therefore, he who resists authority has opposed the ordinance of God, and they who have opposed will receive condemnation upon themselves. For rulers are not a cause of fear for good behavior, but for evil. Do you want to have no fear of authority? Do what is good, and you will have praise from the same. For it is a minister of God to you for good. But if you do what is evil, be afraid, for it does not bear the sword for nothing. For it is a minister of God and an avenger who brings wrath upon the one who practices evil." Now that sounds pretty straightforward, that we should always submit to authority. However, sometimes we find ourselves in a situation where the gospel has to look to a higher authority. And I've run into this years ago in Alaska. There was an Air Force base near where I lived who had a Mormon who was he was the commander of the base. And through his authority, he was able to get a Mormon chaplain placed in the Protestant pulpit in the base chapel. And people came to our ministry and wanted to know, what can we do about this? Because, you know, if they speak out against it, they could be disciplined. Well, what we did was we volunteered a bunch of our literature. We had a bunch of tracts that we published exposing the problem of Mormonism. And we said, you know, you guys can just distribute some of these things around the base and see what happens. So they did. They distributed a few hundred of them around the base and in the chapel. And it wasn't long before I get a nasty letter from the commander of the Air Force base, and he's demanding that I cease and desist. And so I wrote him back and I said, well, I'm not going to cease and desist. To start with, you have no authority over me. I'm a civilian. And secondly, if you want to talk about theological problems, we can have that discussion. But as far as the distribution of our literature, that would be like him saying, if you litter my Air Force base with the local newspaper, I'm going to go after the newspaper company. Okay? So there's these little games that people who are in places of authority, there's these little games that they play in order to manipulate Christians. Now this goes way back into biblical times, but let's go back to say the time of maybe Napoleon or during the days of the Reformation in Europe. And what had happened, obviously, is people were beginning to question the authority of Rome. Okay, so Martin Luther, of course, he was a good Catholic guy, but he saw the corruption and he spoke out against it. Okay, so obviously we honor him as one of God's servants, right? However, today, quite often what you run into is people who will say, well, judge not, lest you be judged, brother, or you're not supposed to speak out against God's anointed, or some crazy thing like that. Okay, so there's kind of a balancing act that we have to deal with here. I mean, we can read in the book of Acts where, in the first few chapters, where the disciples speak out against the leaders of the Jewish authority because, of course, they wanted them to shut up. They didn't want to hear any more about this Jesus. And they, oftentimes they whipped them. And but they usually their reply was, whether it's right to obey God or you be the judge. And they continued on preaching the gospel. So there's these little games that people play. And then back during the Reformation, see what Rome did is they pretty much owned and controlled most of the economics of Europe. And so when people begin to raise up and question Roman authority, well, they could deal with, the Roman Church could put pressure on it economically. And that can happen in our society, even in America today, where they change the rules. I mean, they've changed a lot of rules regarding gender and sex and all that sort of thing, and especially with the public school system, we see that, to where you're afraid to put your kid in a public school system because you know what they're going to be exposed to, and then eventually their brain gets twisted around to where you have a hard time unwashing the brain that's been washed, right? And so people take their kids out. Now, there's one thing to be able to take the kids out, but not everybody has that liberty, or they're not in a position financially to where they can do that. So here, let's go back to the Dearborn, Michigan thing. So this guy, this pastor guy, he means well. However, he just said, well, God bless you, and he basically walked away from this situation. When in fact, he has all the legal right to go after this mayor. Because here this mayor is trying to impose Sharia, Muslim law, on a Christian, and he doesn't have the authority to do so. So this pastor could take this guy to court, and things could work out a little bit different. Now, Dearborn has already gone through a number of lawsuits. Years ago, there was a bunch of evangelists that ended up suing Dearborn over similar issues like what we're talking about. But one of the things that happened, like back during the Reformation, there was a doctrine, a Christian doctrine, that popped up, and mainly it came out of France, and it was called Quietism. And the idea was you could get so spiritual that you were beyond sin, and that you were so perfect through your own discipline, sanctification, that you not only didn't sin anymore, but you could just meditate, and your prayers didn't have to be spoken verbally, but just your quiet prayers could meet the requirements of God. Okay, so now here's the problem with that. All religions meditate on their supposed scriptures or their beliefs. And we're to do the same as Christians. We're to meditate upon the scripture. However, the principle in the Bible is if you believe in your heart and say with your mouth, confess with your mouth that Jesus is Lord, you will be saved. Okay, so you have to say something. And that has to do with exercising your faith. It's one thing to believe something. It's quite another thing to step out and verbally express it publicly where you might be criticized. Okay, so this quietism thing is something that politicians use to shut the mouths of Christians. Now, they may mean well, and they will quote verses like, well, you know, you're not supposed to judge. Judge not, lest you'll be judged. They take that one out of context. That's Matthew chapter 7, verse 1. They fail to realize that the rest of the chapter goes on to talk about false prophets and that you're supposed to watch out for them. Okay? And then Paul, later in Ephesians, says you're not only just to watch out for them, you're supposed to expose them. So in order to expose something like that, you have to say something. So now, throughout the Bible, prayer has to do with language and speaking things. So it's really important that you're specific about what you say when you pray. And I remember back when I was a young Christian, I worked for a guy who had no legs. And I would hear him pray for things that I would never think to pray for because, you know, he had no legs. And it was always interesting to me. He enables us to write things down, make a prayer list, and then pray your list, okay? And so I made a practice of doing that in my first few years of being a Christian. And he said, now go back a month or two later and look at your list and see how God worked that out. And it was always amazing to me how that really worked out, because it was very rarely worked out the way I thought it would work out, but nonetheless, God would answer the prayers. So, see, the idea during the early church was that the Pope, he was divine, or he was the divine vicar of Christ. That was the idea that the Roman Church portrayed. And so this emperor, the Caesar, or in Russia they call him the Tsar, or in Germany it was the Kaiser. There's just different names for the same thing. So fast forward to the days of the Reformation, and there were czars and kaisers and emperors and whatnot in small little kingdoms throughout Europe. And quite often, these people, if they had any Christian conviction or not, they may be somewhat just, but then they still had to deal with the corrupt financial system of the Roman Empire, which ruled most of Europe. So, as people, as czars and Caesars and emperors would come and go, you'd find different waves of authority. And so that's what the early church had to deal with. And so at one point, like I said, this whole idea of quietism became used, and actually it has popped up in America too. I remember back 25 years ago or so, there was a book published, and it was basically the writings of Madame Guyon and Fenelon and some of these characters that promoted that stuff, that quietist doctrine. And basically it's kind of a fatalistic idea of God's kingdom. It's similar to what we might call hyper-Calvinism, that everything is predestined and nothing that you do is going to change anything. Well, then why pray? You know, if God doesn't answer our prayers and everything is predestined, well, does he really predestine Muslim people to take over a town like Dearborn? Does he predestine Muslims to invade Jerusalem in the 7th century and build a mosque on the old Temple Mount? Did he really predestine? Did he predestine the fall of Constantinople in 1453? Was that God's plan, or was that the devil's plan? See, the devil has a plan as well. And sometimes Christians don't know the difference, and that's the big problem. The devil can quote Bible verses. He quoted Bible verses to Jesus, right? Or jump off this temple and the angels will bear you up, right? I mean, he'll take things out of context like he did in that case. So, when politicians use the church, which they often do, for political goals, Well, say picture living in Utah, or maybe southern Idaho, or eastern Washington now. We have Mormon churches everywhere. In many cases, you have Mormons that are mayors, and sometimes they end up governors, or they end up in Washington, D.C., and they're dictating policy. But see, they look at things from a slightly different perspective than maybe the rest of us. The problem is today is political views are often divided into right or left. But usually Mormons fall into the right category, as do Jehovah's Witnesses. Now, Jehovah's Witnesses are a little different cup of tea because they don't want to have anything to do with government. They don't go in the military. They normally don't want to get involved in local politics or any kind of government. Half the time, I don't think they even vote because they have this idea that all civil government is of the devil. It's all evil, therefore they shouldn't get involved in it. Well, to think about how crazy that is, how twisted that is, think about Daniel, the prophet in the Old Testament. God put him in a place of authority, right? And God used him. Well, how about Joseph? He's sold into slavery, right? And he ends up going down to Egypt as a slave. And then fast forward a few years, he gets out of prison because the Pharaoh finds out he has some supernatural insight on things. And so he becomes a right-hand man to the Pharaoh. So, see, the idea of Christians not getting involved in government is simply not biblical. And then, so here's another issue. Sometimes if you bring up the idea that, well, maybe the church should have some guys, undercover guys, some security guys, maybe that carry guns, you know. And some people recoil from that, and they'll think, well, no, the Christians should never carry a gun. Oh, okay, think about this. So if a police officer gets saved, he becomes a Christian, does all of a sudden he have to put his gun aside? Does he have to quit his job? Now see how that would just leave a void in the police force. And do you want a police force that has no righteous people in it? I mean, that doesn't sound very good. Now see, some of these things, people, they don't really think it through. At one point, during the time of Napoleon, now see, Napoleon had issues with Roman authority. And he basically went to war against Rome. And he was a pretty sharp guy. I don't think he was a Christian by any means, but he knew the lingo, see? And he knew that he could use the church, and he could use church leaders and people that knew the Bible. He could use them for his cause, see? And so I think God used Napoleon for a while to push back against the authority of Rome. However, he went way too far. Next thing you know, he becomes his own Caesar. He becomes his own king, right? he becomes the Pope, kind of. So there's the danger. And when secular people get too much power, when they use Christian folks or a Christian movement to elevate themselves into a place of authority. Now see, we can see the same thing could happen with this thing that just happened with Charlie Kirk. Now, he had a pretty interesting ministry, powerful ministry, used within the realm of politics, and then he gets martyred, okay? And of course, emotionally, a lot of people, get caught up in the emotions of that, and especially the right side of politics, the Mormons, of course. Yeah, now, the Mormons are not Christians. I mean, the Mormons, for example, have been instrumental in financing the building of several Muslim mosques and even a Hindu temple down Salt Lake Valley. And this is not just in my opinion. There's the imam of the mosque down in Jordan, Utah. He spoke about it on a video here not too long ago that you can watch on YouTube. That he was given, I think, $25,000 or something like that for the construction of his mosque. Well, his mosque, that was probably 10% of what he really needed. But it's the whole point is, see, the Mormons will play the game with whoever they can for political clout or for votes. So here's the problem. uh, don't judge my quietism. Now, us Christians not only have to speak up, we have to act up. We have to do things. And it's all well and good to come to church and sing songs and pray and preach at each other, but if it never goes outside the church, it's basically a waste of time, because we have to put legs to our prayers.